Part 1. Introduction. The shadows in the flame. The flame of a single candle does more than just provide light. It creates shadows. It casts long, dancing silhouettes against the walls of our understanding, revealing that the text we hold so dear, the Holy Scripture, is not merely a book of comforting verses and moral instructions. It is a window into a primordial world, a world far stranger, more terrifying, and more majestic than our modern minds dare to comprehend. We often approach the early chapters of Genesis with a sense of familiarity. We visualize the garden, the fruit, the fratricide of Cain, and then, almost immediately, we jump to the image of a wooden boat filled with animals. But there is a gap in the narrative. There is a stumbling block that stands between the fall of man and the great flood. It is a text that many have tried to skip over, to allegorize, or to explain away, because its implications are simply too unsettling. I speak of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Here, in the twilight of the antediluvian world, the Bible whispers of an event that shattered the boundaries of creation. It speaks of sons of God descending, of daughters of men being taken, and of a race of giants, the Nephilim, walking the earth. Why do we hesitate to look this passage in the eye? Perhaps because it forces us to admit that the history of our world is not just a human history, but a cosmic one. Tonight, by the light of this candle, let us summon the courage to explore the truths that history has tried to forget. Part 2. The body into the deep. Subsection A. The historical and cultural context. To understand the weight of Genesis 6, we must first strip away our 21st century lenses. We live in a disenchanted world, a world where the material and the spiritual are kept in separate, airtight compartments. But the ancient reader, the Hebrew wandering the desert or the Babylonian looking up at the ziggurat, lived in a porous universe. For them, the veil between the realm of the gods and the realm of men was terrifyingly thin. Genesis was not written in a vacuum. It emerged in a culture dominated by Mesopotamian narratives, stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Atrahasis epic. In those pagan traditions, the mixing of gods and humans was celebrated. The great kings of old claimed to be semi-divine, hybrid hero kings who bridged the gap between heaven and earth. They called these beings the Apkallu, wise sages from the deep who brought civilization to mankind. However, the biblical narrative enters this cultural conversation not to agree, but to polemicize. Where the pagans saw these hybrids as heroes and bringers of wisdom, the Hebrew text strips away the glory to reveal the horror. It presents a world where the hierarchy of creation, the divine order established in Genesis 1, has been violently transgressed. This is not a story of civilization's rise. It is the diagnosis of its terminal cancer. To understand why God would grieve that he made man, we must understand that the man walking the earth in those days was perhaps no longer entirely mankind. Subsection B. Decoding the Scripture and Evidence. Let us turn our eyes to the text itself. Genesis 6:2 reads, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." The term used here for sons of God is Bnei Ha-Elohim. In the Hebrew Bible, this specific phrase is a technical term used almost exclusively to describe direct creations of the Almighty, specifically the angelic host. We see this clearly in the book of Job, where the Bnei Ha-Elohim present themselves before the Lord, and later, when they shout for joy at the laying of the earth's foundations. For centuries, the oldest Jewish commentators and the early church fathers understood this plainly. These were angelic beings who rebelled against their station. The text contrasts them with the daughters of men, Benoth Adam, referencing female humanity. The grammatical construction implies a violent snatching. They took whomever they chose. This was an act of domination and unauthorized crossing of boundaries. And what was the result of this forbidden union? Verse 4 tells us, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." The King James Version translates Nephilim as giants, relying on the Greek Septuagint term gigantes. While they were indeed men of great stature and renown, the Hebrew root naphal means to fall. They are the fallen ones, or perhaps more actively, the fellers, those who cause others to fall. These were the mighty men of old, men of renown. In the eyes of the world, they were legendary heroes, the Hercules and Achilles of mythology. But in the eyes of Scripture, they were biological abominations, the living evidence of a spiritual insurrection that had bled into the physical world. Subsection C. The hidden theological meaning. Why does this matter to our theology? Why can we not simply view this as a metaphor for bad people marrying other bad people? Because if we the supernatural from Genesis 6, we lose the profound logic of the flood. If we read Genesis 6 merely as humans sinning, God's reaction, the total annihilation of all biological life, save for one family and the animals, seems disproportionately cruel. Why destroy the animals? Why destroy the very genetic fabric of the world? The hidden theological depth here reveals that the flood was not an act of anger, but an act of salvation. It was a necessary surgery to excise a cosmic infection. The promise given in the Garden of Eden was that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. The serpent, therefore, had a strategic countermove to corrupt the seed of the woman. If the angelic host could hybridize with humanity, they could pollute the human genome to the point where no pure human vessel would remain to bring forth the Messiah. When the text says that Noah was perfect in his generations, Genesis 6-9, the Hebrew word used is tamen, which refers to physical blemishlessness, like a sacrificial lamb. It implies that Noah's family was not just morally righteous, but genetically uncontaminated. They were the last remnants of true humanity. Therefore, this narrative reveals a God who is fiercely protective of his image. The image of God is not a playground for rogue spiritual entities to reshape. The flood was the reset button, a washing away of the hybrid chaos to preserve the possibility of human redemption. It shows us that the war for our souls is not just a moral struggle, but an ontological one, a battle for what it means to be truly human. Subsection D. Controversies and theories. Admittedly, this interpretation makes us uncomfortable. It sounds like mythology. It sounds like science fiction. Because of this discomfort, a rival theory gained prominence around the 4th century AD, championed by figures like St. Augustine. This is known as the Sethite view. The Sethite theory proposes that the sons of God were merely the righteous descendants of Seth, Adam's third son, and the daughters of men were the rebellious line of Cain. It argues that the sin was simply believers marrying non-believers. This view became the dominant dogma for centuries because it sanitized the text. It removed the messy, embarrassing supernatural elements and made the Bible more palatable to the rational mind. However, we must ask the difficult questions. If these were simply Sethite men marrying Cainite women, why did their offspring become Nephilim giants and mighty warriors? Why does the union of a believer and a non-believer produce a biological anomaly? Spiritual compromise does not result in genetic mutation. Furthermore, the New Testament writers seem to reject the Sethite view. The Epistle of Jude and the Second Epistle of Peter explicitly compare the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah to the angels who kept not their first estate and gave themselves over to strange flesh. The ancient writers of Scripture did not share our modern skepticism. They understood that the universe is a crowded place, filled with intelligences that are hostile to God's order. By trying to make the Bible rational by modern standards, we risk silencing the very warnings it tries to give us. Part 3. Conclusion. The eternal echo. The synthesis. As we draw back from the ancient abyss of Genesis 6, the picture becomes clear. This is not a fable. It is the account of a cosmic boundary violation. It is the story of how the spiritual realm sought to colonize the physical realm, creating a chaotic hybridity that threatened to erase the image of God from the earth. The flood, therefore, stands not as a monument to divine rage, but as a testament to divine preservation. God intervened to stop the corruption, to preserve the human line, and to keep the path open for the incarnation, for the true Son of God to one day arrive, not to exploit humanity, but to save it. The reflection. The candle burns low, and the shadows lengthen. We might think that the days of the Nephilim are buried deep in the silt of the deluge, forgotten history for a forgotten time. But Jesus himself warned us, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. What defined the days of Noah? It was not just violence, it was the tampering with the definition of life itself. Today, as we stand on the precipice of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and the merging of man with machine, are we not hearing the faint, rhythmic drumbeat of that ancient transgression? Are we not, once again, trying to transcend our humanity, to become like gods, to reshape the boundaries that the Creator set in place? Genesis 6 remains a mirror. It asks us a haunting question. When we seek to surpass our human limits, are we ascending to divinity, or are we merely inviting the chaos to return? May the truth of the Word guide you through the shadows. Until next